biocomputing is going to create more new wealth over the next 10 years than almost anything else you could put your money into right now. And almost nobody watching this is positioned for it. I want to say that clearly right at the top, because I don't say things like this lightly. I've spent close to 50 years watching money move around the world. I've watched bubbles form out of nothing, and I've watched real permanent shifts get laughed off as nonsense by very smart people. And I'm telling you, based on everything I know about how these shifts actually happen, this one is real right now. In labs you have probably never heard of, scientists are growing actual human brain cells, real living neurons, on top of computer chips, and getting them to think, not metaphorically, actually think, learn, solve problems on their own. And the only reason anyone is doing something that sounds like science fiction is because the entire economics of computing has hit a wall, and somebody has to find a way around it. Whoever does is going to make an enormous amount of money, and the small number of people who understand this early are going to make it right alongside them. Before I go any further, I want to ask you for one thing, and I'm going to be honest about why. What I'm about to walk you through took weeks to research and pull together properly in the world I came up in. This is exactly the kind of thinking hedge funds pay analysts 6 figures a year to find before anyone else does. I'm handing it to you for free right now in the next 20 minutes. All I'm asking in return is that you subscribe before you keep watching. It costs you nothing. It takes 2 seconds, and it means the next time something like this crosses my desk, you'll actually be the one who sees it first instead of hearing about it from a friend after the money's already been made. Go ahead, tap subscribe now, and then come right back, because this next part matters. Let me start by explaining the wall, because you have to understand the problem clearly before you can understand where the money is going to flow. Everything artificial intelligence does, every chatbot answer, every image it generates, every model that gets trained on billions of pieces of data runs on electricity. That's the whole business, stripped down to its simplest form. Intelligence at the machine level is nothing more than electricity being pushed through silicon extremely fast. For the last several years, the companies building these systems have been locked in a straightforward arms race. Bigger chips, more chips, bigger buildings, full of chips, cooled by more water and more power than most small cities use in a year. That approach worked beautifully for a long stretch. It's the reason a handful of technology companies became worth more than most nations on Earth. But here's the part almost nobody wants to say out loud in public. That approach is running directly into a hard physical limit, and the limit is electricity itself. Think about your own brain for a moment. It runs on roughly 20 watts of power. That's less electricity than the light bulb hanging over your kitchen table. And with that tiny amount of energy, it can recognize a face in a crowded room, understand a joke, plan a vacation 6 months out, and still feel a flash of regret about a decision you made 10 years ago. Now compare that to the machines running today's largest AI models. Some of these data centers pull as much electricity as a mid-sized city, running around the clock every single day of the year. Multiply that across every major AI company racing to build the next version of their model, and you begin to understand why Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Meta Some of the wealthiest companies that have ever existed in human history are suddenly cutting deals to build their own private power plants, including nuclear ones. One of these companies has actually moved to reopen a reactor at the site of the worst nuclear accident in American history, purely to get more electricity onto the grid for their computers. Let that sink in for a second. That is not the behavior of a confident industry cruising along. That is the behavior of an industry that has hit a wall and is getting genuinely desperate. And here is something I've learned over 5 decades of doing this. Desperation inside a big enough industry with enough capital behind it is one of the most reliable signals you will ever get handed. It tells you exactly where the next wave of money has to go, because the people holding the largest pools of capital in the world simply cannot afford to stay stuck where they are. So if the old approach of bigger chips and more raw electricity is running into a ceiling, what's the alternative path forward? This is where biocomputing enters the picture, and I want to explain it the plain, simple way, because the underlying science gets complicated fast, but the economic logic behind it is not complicated at all. Instead of continuing to force a machine to think the way silicon thinks, a small group of very serious scientists, quietly backed by very serious money, started asking a different question altogether. What if we simply use the thing that already performs this exact job better than anything human beings have ever managed to build from scratch? A brain, not a robotic brain modeled after an actual biological one, or at least real living neurons grown from human skin cells in a laboratory setting. Researchers take those cells, grow them into a small living network on a dish, and wire that network directly onto a silicon chip. Then they give the network a task along with a reward signal, the exact same basic principle used to train a dog, and the living network figures out how to solve the task entirely on its own, without anyone writing a line of code to tell it how. There's a lab in Australia that did precisely this, using a simple video game, and the small cluster of living neurons learned to play it competently in roughly a week, using a fraction of the electricity a traditional chip would burn through, doing the same job. I know exactly how strange that sounds, because I felt the same jolt of disbelief the first time I read about it myself. But strange and profitable have never been opposites in my experience. In fact, over the course of my career, I've found they overlap far more often than most people are comfortable admitting to themselves. I think it's worth pausing on why this particular approach, and not some other clever engineering trick, is the one gathering real momentum. Right now, engineers have spent decades trying to squeeze more performance out of traditional chips, and they've done an extraordinary job of it. But squeezing efficiency out of silicon is a game of diminishing returns. Every additional improvement costs more and delivers less than the one before it. Biology doesn't have that problem, because evolution already spent hundreds of millions of years optimizing a thinking machine for energy efficiency long before anyone was worried about electricity bills. A living neuron doesn't need a fan, doesn't need a cooling system the size of a warehouse, and doesn't need a power substation built next door. When an industry runs out of room to improve along its existing path, it doesn't usually give up. It looks sideways for a completely different path that was previously ignored because it seemed too strange or too far outside the mainstream to take seriously. That sideways move is exactly where I've made some of the better calls of my career, and it's exactly where I believe we are standing today. Here's a principle I've relied on for my entire career, and it applies directly to what's happening right now. Almost every major shift in wealth throughout history follows the exact same basic shape. Something breaks in the old way of doing things, usually a cost problem or a resource constraint that simply cannot be engineered around any further. And the solution that emerges looks absurd right up until the very moment it becomes completely obvious to everyone. When the printing press first appeared, plenty of intelligent, educated people dismissed it as a passing novelty for monks. When electricity started replacing steam power inside factories, most factory owners at the time genuinely believed it was too unreliable and too experimental to bet their entire operation on. When the internet first showed up in offices and homes, serious, well-respected investors publicly called it a toy for hobbyists and academics with too much free time. In every single one of those cases, the people who dismissed the shift purely because it looked strange, small, or premature ended up missing the largest transfer of wealth of their entire generation. And notice something important here. The people who actually made real money from those shifts usually weren't the smartest people in the room about the underlying technology itself. They were the people who understood the underlying economic pressure driving the shift and who had the patience to position themselves calmly before the rest of the world finally caught on and rushed in. Biocomputing sits in exactly that same spot today. On the surface, it looks like a strange science curiosity buried in an academic journal somewhere. Underneath the surface, it is a direct, rational response to the single largest cost problem currently facing the most valuable companies on the entire planet. That gap between how something looks on the surface and what it actually represents underneath happens to be precisely where the real money gets made every single time. Now, I want to show you this isn't some fringe idea floating around a university newsletter that nobody serious is paying attention to. Real capital is already moving here, quietly in the background. While most people are focused on the flashier headlines, there are companies operating today that sell working biocomputing systems directly to research labs and pharmaceutical companies using lab-grown neurons to run pattern recognition and drugs, screening tasks at a tiny fraction of the power cost of traditional silicon chips. Established chip manufacturers, the very same companies that build the processors sitting inside your laptop right now, are quietly funding early research into hybrid systems that combine silicon architecture with living biological tissue. Government defense research agencies, the kind that historically fund breakthrough ideas a full decade or more before the public ever hears a whisper about them, have already committed serious funding to biological computing programs, because whoever solves the energy problem in computing first doesn't just gain a financial edge, they gain a genuine strategic advantage on the world stage. And several of the very same hyperscale technology companies I mentioned earlier, the ones currently building private nuclear reactors just to keep their AI data centers running around the clock, are separately funding early-stage research into biological and neuromorphic computing as a long-term hedge against the exact same energy wall they're slamming into right now. When you see the largest, most cautious most risk-averse capital allocators on Earth quietly hedging their bets in the same direction. That tells you something important. These are not reckless people prone to chasing fads. They move slowly. They move with enormous amounts of money behind every decision. And right now, quietly, they are moving here. I'd also point out something that took me a long time to appreciate earlier in my career. The most valuable signals rarely arrive as a single headline. They arrive as a pattern spread across several unrelated corners of the economy, all pointing in the same direction at roughly the same time. A university lab publishing a strange result, a defense agency quietly opening a funding line, a chip company mentioning a side project on an earnings call almost as an afterthought, a hyperscaler burying a small line item about biological computing research inside a much larger announcement about data center expansion. Individually, none of those things make headlines. Together, they tell you exactly where serious, patient money believes the future is heading long before the general public ever catches on, learning to read that pattern rather than waiting for someone to hand you the conclusion in a headline is one of the more valuable skills I've built over the decades. And it's exactly the skill I'm trying to hand to you here. I want to slow down here for a moment, though, because this is the part that most exciting content about new technology tends to skip entirely, and it happens to be the exact part that actually protects your money from getting hurt. Being early to a genuinely real trend and being reckless about a genuinely real trend are two completely different things. And over the years, I have personally watched brilliant, capable people confuse the two and lose a great deal of money because of it. So here is the honest, unvarnished truth about biocomputing as it stands today. It is still extremely early. Most of what currently exists is the research stage, not the revenue stage. And there's a very long distance between a lab experiment and a mature, profitable business. The lab in Australia I mentioned earlier is not a company you can simply go buy shares of tomorrow morning and expect to retire on. Most of the players currently doing the actual biological research work are small, largely unproven, and likely years away from anything resembling a mature, cash-generating business model. History is absolutely littered with technologies that were directionally correct about the future and still managed to bankrupt the first wave of investors who bet everything on one single name far too early. The internet as a trend was completely real. Most of the individual internet stocks from 1999 still went to zero within a few short years. Electric vehicles were obviously the future for well over a decade before most of the companies chasing that future actually made a single investor any real money. Being correct about the broader trend and being correct about which specific company ultimately wins the race are two entirely separate skills, and confusing the two is precisely how otherwise sharp, capable people end up losing their shirts on ideas that were genuinely good. There's another lesson buried in that risk that I think matters even more than the specific examples. When a trend is genuinely real, the market has a habit of getting the timing wrong in both directions. It gets impatient early, bidding up companies that are years away from actually earning the money the excitement implies. And then it gets fearful too early as well, walking away from the space entirely the moment the first wave of hype fades and reality sets in. Some of the best returns I've ever seen came from people who were willing to stay interested in a real trend through that middle stretch, the boring stretch, after the hype has died down, but before the real revenue shows up. That stretch is uncomfortable to sit through. And it's exactly why so few people actually collect the reward at the end of it. So how do you actually position yourself for something like this without gambling your entire savings on one single lab that might not even exist in 5 years? This is exactly where I'd apply the same discipline I've used throughout my entire career, and it comes down to a handful of simple, repeatable principles rather than chasing a single hot stock tip. First, when you genuinely don't know which specific company will win a brand new technology race, you don't actually need to know. Instead, you spread your exposure across the broader ecosystem that has to grow regardless of who the ultimate winner turns out to be 5 or 10 years from now. In this case, that means the established chip manufacturers are already quietly funding hybrid research on the side, because even if pure biocomputing takes a full decade to mature into something commercially viable, those companies benefit. Either way the story plays out. It also means the specialty materials and laboratory equipment suppliers who provide the actual tools these biology labs need to grow neurons and interface them properly with silicon, because someone has to supply the picks and shovels, regardless of which specific mine ends up striking gold first. Second, treat this as a small, deliberately asymmetric slice of a much larger portfolio, not a bet the house type of decision that keeps you up at night. The kind of position is sized so that if it does absolutely nothing for the next 5 years, it doesn't meaningfully hurt you. But if it becomes what the early signals genuinely suggest it could become, the eventual payoff is large enough to actually matter to your life. That's not gambling. That's simply sound portfolio construction being applied thoughtfully to something unfamiliar and new. Third, and this is the one that people ignore most often because patience is unglamorous. Give it real time. Genuine paradigm shifts like this one rarely play out over the course of a single year. They typically unfold over a full decade or longer in distinct stages, with real setbacks and false starts happening along the way. Patience isn't just a nice virtue to have here. In this particular case, patience is practically the entire strategy on its own. If you take away just one thing from everything I've walked you through today, let it be this: the largest energy crisis in the history of modern computing is not some minor side story buried on page 12. It is the actual story, and it is currently forcing some of the wealthiest, most conservative pools of capital in the entire world to fund a solution that sounds like pure science fiction, purely because the alternative, running out of the electricity needed to power the future of technology, is simply not an acceptable outcome for them to sit back and accept. That kind of relentless pressure applied by that staggering amount of capital tends to produce real, tangible outcomes, eventually, even when the earliest steps along the way look genuinely strange to outside observers. Your job in all of this isn't to become a trained neuroscientist overnight. And it isn't to correctly guess the one single winning company 5 years before everybody else figures it out. Your job is simply to recognize the underlying pattern early, position yourself sensibly and thoughtfully across it, and then let time and patience quietly do the rest of the work for you, the exact same way it always has for anyone who got in early on a genuine structural shift rather than a passing fad. I've personally made plenty of mistakes over the years chasing exciting new ideas too early and sizing my bets far too aggressively, and I've also made real money from ideas that sounded completely ridiculous the very first time I heard them described out loud, only to look painfully obvious in hindsight a few years later. Biocomputing carries every single hallmark of that. Second category, I could be wrong about the timeline. I could be wrong about which specific players end up mattering most in the end. Nobody gets every detail of a shift like this right. And I've been humbled enough times over the decades to say that honestly instead of pretending otherwise, but I'd rather be roughly right early than precisely right too late. And that's been true for nearly every decision that's actually built wealth in my career. So here is my honest challenge to you. Before you close this video, don't act purely on hype, and please don't act purely out of a fear of missing out either. Go take a real look at the actual companies quietly funding this space today. Understand the meaningful difference between the pure research plays and the established players simply hedging their bets on the side, and build a position sized appropriately for your own personal risk tolerance and time horizon, not mine. If you want the deeper research behind everything I just laid out for you, every company mentioned, every number, every original source, it's completely free. It's linked right below this video. And if watching this actually helped you think differently about where the next decade of real wealth is likely to get built, go ahead and subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of structural shift I plan on tracking closely from here on out.